Hello and welcome to my latest video. So in this video we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be showing you how to paint the Squigboss here that Games Workshop sent me for free, but I'm also going to be reviewing some paints that I've been out and bought because I've seen some reviews for them and they sounded kind of interesting. So it's the Too Thin Coats series of paints from Duncan Rhodes. So the whole of this Squigboss is going to be painted using these paints. And these are ones that I've bought myself as well, so it's not like I've been paid to or sent them for free or anything. These are all things that I've just wanted to try out. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm doing with the paint. So at the moment I'm using the boar hide colour. You'll have to excuse me getting the names on these, so this is the first time I've seen the paints or anything, so the names are completely alien, but I'm going to try and give you the equivalent for Games Workshop as well. So the boar hide is, I'm pretty confident, the same, or trying to be the same as Fang brown. It's a little bit more red, and you can see as I'm applying it, so I decided to paint the face mask of the goblin in a non-metallic metal gold kind of style. And I thought it would be interesting as well because I'm just going to paint this the way that I normally would paint a model, but the properties of these paints are slightly different to Games Workshop and Vallejo, so the way that I use the paint I have to kind of tweak it a little bit. Also, because the paint range is a little bit newer, there's not that many colours to select from, so every now and then I will have mixed my own variation on the wet palette just so that I can actually get the colours that I want. The main thing that I noticed when using these paints, although it's not that true about the boar hide colour, is that the opacity seems to be quite high in comparison to Games Workshop. So they're closer to the base layer paints from Games Workshop rather than the they're base paints rather than the layer paints from Games Workshop. So the base paints tend to be more opaque and the layer paints are more translucent. And most of the paints from the Too Thin Coats series seem to be a little bit more opaque than the Games Workshop equivalents, although that's not always the case, and I'll mention those when I get to them. So now I'm on the goblin, painting some of the armour in. So it's all just kind of like base work at the moment. There's nothing too fancy that's going on here. The shoulder pads, they're going to be sort of like a dirty sort of steel, non-metallic metal style as well, like very scratchy and a little bit sort of dirty and worn as well. And that works quite well with the design of them, because if you look carefully on the shoulder pads, they've got kind of sort of very obvious facets on them, and there's also like little dents and all sorts of details and things. So the scratchy kind of effect is a little bit easy to achieve. And if you look on the wet palette there on the left hand side, you can see a selection of grey colours. These are all mixed, apart from, so the bottom left is the black. I believe that's called Doom Death Black, kind of an interesting name. But then the two grey colours above that, that's just black mixed with grey or white. So just so I have a variety of greys to pick from. The only grey that I noticed was Carcharodon grey, which is the second in from the left, the grey at the bottom there. So on the staff here, again, it's going to be a non-metallic metal effect, but this is going to be painted a little bit differently to the shoulder pads, but starting off with the same colours. So again, this is just base work at the moment. It's a bit unfair to compare the greys to kind of like any other paint range, because like I said, I've mixed at least two of these myself. So the actual properties of it are slightly different, but the it works pretty well. But to be fair, like grey colours in pretty much any paint range, they work really well. So it doesn't matter which paint range you're going to pick for using greys. I've never found any grey paints that are particularly bad. So there's no particular bonus for picking the Too Thin Coats colours for this. And then you can see on the underside of the curve of the hook thing, I've gone from boar hide again. I do like the boar hide colour quite a lot, actually. as I mentioned, it's very similar to Mournfang Brown from Games Workshop, but the colour's just a little bit richer. In a way, you could probably use it as like a highlight colour, but the other thing is, it's actually quite similar in terms of translucency to Mournfang Brown as well. So, but I think that the finish is more matte, and it might be a touch more opaque, but it's not massively different. So the negative thing for these two thin coats paints is they're very expensive. They cost more per milliliter than the Games Workshop paints, and the bottles that they come in are horrible. The one benefit of the bottles, I mean, it's not really of the bottles, but the packaging itself, is it does have a shaker inside, so the paints, they mix together really nicely when you shake them. If the paint's separated, it will mix together much more easily than other paints, because it has the little shaker thing inside. But the actual bottles, they're just horrible, cheap things. Like in comparison to the Vallejo bottles, these are much worse. Also, they're a bit opaque. I know that's quite similar to, not opaque, they're a bit sort of cloudy, so you can't see the colour of the paint through them very well. So the boar hide colour it looks sort of like a very pale brown when you look at the bottle, and then when you see it on the wet palette, so it's the middle right hand side paint, it is really rich and vibrant there. So you do get a very poor idea of what the actual colours look like. The Games Workshop pots are a little bit better in that regard. They're not perfect because they're still a bit cloudy, so you see through them. But you can still see a bit more clearly what colour you're actually going to get when you open the bottle. And the Vallejo ones as well, when comparing to model colour, they're a little bit more see-through, so you can see what colour paint it is. The only other thing I would say is, so I've just been and got the new Vallejo game colour paints, and I'm going to do a different video review for those. But the bottles on these are fantastic because you can see exactly what colour the paint is. They're completely transparent, the cases. But yeah, so I'm not overly impressed with the cases, and I mean the bottles and the price of the Duncan paints, but the actual paints themselves, they do seem to be quite nice to work with. Just to talk about what I'm still doing with the Goblin at the minute, it's pretty straightforward at this stage, and it's very similar to what I normally do when adding a lot of texture to a model. So I've just been pretty much using the greys that you saw on the left that I mixed in, and it's just sort of scratchy work all over, picking out the edges for definition. For the first stage highlight that I'm doing on the hook, it's wait, let me check the paint. Wolf Grey. This one is Wolf Grey mixed with white. So if you look on the wet palette there, it's the second from the left, one and then one down. That's the Wolf Grey base colour, and then above that it's the white that I've mixed it with. So I'm actually not using the straight Wolf Grey from the pot. I have mixed it with the white to get this highlight colour, because the first stage highlight that I'm using on the hook is a lot lighter. It's lighter than the greys that I've already used as the base colour, so I needed it as a highlight colour. And the idea of it being blue is it reflects some of the sky colouring. The Wolf Grey, fine, again, really nice colour, nice flat even coverage, and it has a nice matte finish. Most of the colours actually from this Two Thin Coats range have really nice, not completely matte, but sort of a not quite satin. They're more matte than satin anyway, and they're really nice to work with. My suspicion is that they wanted to get the Two Thin Coats kind of philosophy into the paint, so that you would only need two thin coats to get an opaque finish, and that does seem to work pretty much as I would expect. And I must say, actually, the the white star. I guess that's supposed to be similar to white scar, but yeah, white star is a really nice white paint, much better than any of the Games Workshop white colours, so it's very smooth and easy to work with. I probably will use that quite often, even with other paint ranges and things like that. I know my favourite white paint is P3 Mora White, and this is very similar in how that works, but the Tooth and Coat's white is a bit more matte with the finish, which is just nice to have as an option anyway. The highlights that you can see on there are just what I'm doing is, so I looked at how the lights hit the model under a lamp. But even if you don't want to do that, I mean, it does help with light placement, but it doesn't give you like the correct shapes and sizes of the highlights, because when you hold the model under a lamp, the light is just hitting a plastic surface, so it's not a metal surface, so it doesn't give it accurate reflections, sizes and shapes and things. But it does give you like the placement roughly correctly. But also the way that I'm applying it. So the paints are thinned. I've not taken those straight from the bottle. I have added some water to each paint, and these do need to be thinned a little bit more than Games Workshop paints because of the extra opacity. The reason I say that is because they flow very nicely when you've added some water to them, but you will still get a very opaque mark for most of the colours when you apply them. Which is really handy in some regards, but in other regards, if you want to get like a translucent mark or a softer mark, you have to thin them much more, which is not like the paint will go further for doing that effect, but it does mean like you have to really consider that when you're making the mark, and you will have to do tests on things to make sure that the mark that you're going to make, because you think when you look at it that the paint is very watered down, then you apply it and suddenly you've got a very hard mark again. So I did find myself having to tweak a lot of the marks I was making because they were leaving quite sharp marks with the brush that I was expecting them to be much softer when they touched the model. You can see the marks I'm actually making. It's kind of interesting because the brush obviously is a small brush. This is my old Artist Opus size 00 brush, and this is quite worn out now. So it's lost additional hairs off of the bristles, but it's still got a very sharp, well, not very sharp, but a reasonably sharp point. And this allows me to do very easy, quick, sharp marks. So really that's like the paints are useful for this, but if I want to sort of quickly block in, and I do this using a size 00 brush quite often, and I can still get softer marks with it, it just I don't know, I just found it very irritating that I had to thin the paint more, but it is just more of like a learning curve. So if you use these paints a lot, I'd imagine that it would just come naturally. You wouldn't have to think about it, but it is also worth bearing in mind. So if you only use these paints, you will probably adapt very quickly and it's not an issue. But if you're using different manufacturers' paints, you have to bear in mind that these paints will behave a little bit differently to the other paints. So even if you thin them down the same amount, you will get a different quality of mark when you apply it. I don't mean quality in good or bad, like just a different, it'll be a bit of a harder mark still. But at the same time, that's really good for if you want to paint a lot of very sharp details on a model, because you can get the paint quite thin, nice and thin, and paint all these details very easily. So now for the next highlights on the hook, so I created what I thought would be close to an ice yellow colour. So I mixed it on the wet palette there, and it's the second from the right in the middle. And that was made using, I think it's one of the yellow colours. I'm not sure. Maybe Dark Sun yellow, or Skulker yellow, and that was mixed with white. And when I looked at it on the wet palette, that looked very, very similar to ice yellow. When I applied it to the model, because of the extra sort of opacity of the paint, when I applied it, it looked way more yellow than ice yellow is. So I then had to go back and with the... Well, first I'm adding white over the top of it, so that desaturates the colour, and then I have to go back also with the wolf grey mixed with white at the edges. And trying to use the opacity of the paint. I'm also mixing in some grey there as well. I remember that. What that was, Carcharodon, whatever. That was the the grey that I had to mix in at the side, and it's just knocking back the yellow a bit. But even with doing all these things, the yellow is still very visible. So again, this is another thing that you will kind of adapt to, but it is worth bearing in mind that the colour can be a little bit stronger than you anticipate. So if you just want to add like subtle little yellow marks to the piece, which is what I was intended, like I didn't want like really strong vibrant yellow, but when I applied it, it was like kind of annoying how strong the colour was, and that then meant that I had to do a lot more work just to go over it and knock that back again. Now, you might say, oh well, you could just add more white to it to get the effect that you want. The thing is, if you add more white, that does desaturate it, so it becomes less yellow. However, that makes it a lot lighter. Like it's kind of like the right level of brightness I wanted, but it was just a thicker paint. So it's more of a case of you have to either water it down a bit more or add some grey to it. And kind of like I'm adding grey in the afterwards, so doing kind of like a similar sort of thing, but again it's more work from what I expected, but as I keep saying, you will adapt to these things. Obviously each paint range is different. It's just that I've been using the paints I have for quite a while, and these were giving me different results than I expected. For the application, when you see it, I'm just using very small amounts of paint on the tip of the brush. So you load up the brush, hardly putting any paint on it, but even then I rub it on my thumb to take off the excess, so you still have a very sharp tip on your brush, which just gives you like a bit more control when you apply it. If you don't rub off the excess paint, when you touch the brush to the model, you'll get a blob on there, and especially with these paints, that will be even worse than with, say, if you were doing in comparison to the Games Workshop layer paints, which are much more translucent. You will have a lot of pigment that you've got to kind of clean off the model, and it'll be much harder to fix by having that blob on there, where if the paint's more translucent, it might look stronger when you first apply it, but it will, as the water evaporates, it becomes much more translucent then, and so basically you get a softer mark. So these are less forgiving if you make mistakes, because the marks are so opaque when you apply them, then you have to spend longer trying to get rid of them. One of the other nice things about these paints that I found was that they stay wet a little bit longer, which is just nice for working with. It's not that much of a problem. It's not like when I'm painting the model, because I'm only using small amounts of paint, it's not that the paint stays really wet on the model, because with the small amount of paint that I'm applying, it still dries pretty quick. It's just that on the wet palette it stays wet a bit longer, so it gives you more working time on the wet palette before having to add more water or whatever, keeping the paints running. But on the model, if you're just using a small amount of paint, it doesn't make any difference. Although it does mean that if you want to do very, very fine details, like say for example if you're painting the eyes on models, or like you want to paint the little white dot on the pupil of a model, what usually happens when you do that is that the paint will dry quickly, because you need a very small amount of paint on just the very tip of your brush. and you have to do that quite quickly or the paint will dry before you get it to the model. Because the paint just stays that little bit wetter for longer, it does mean that you can probably get the white dot on there without having to put excess paint on the brush just so it stays wetter. And you can see there for painting on the hook again, I've just been going backwards and forwards with these colours, trying to blend them in a little bit. So this isn't sort of like a super high-end painting. He is a boss level character, so I did want him to stand out a bit. He's, I'm spending a bit longer on him than I would for a tabletop piece, but not so much that I could enter him into a golden demon or anything like that. But he is I am spending a reasonable amount of time on him, and that's part of the reason why this video is so long, because he's just so many, even though he's a small model and there's not that many varying surfaces on him, it does take a while to paint all these details in. I'm only showing you the front side of the hook as I paint that. You will see, like particularly towards the end of the video, parts of the model will suddenly appear filled in that I haven't showed you. Like it took me a couple of days to paint this, so I can't fit all that into one video, but parts do get painted off screen, but I try and show you as much as I can for the different areas so you get a good idea to replicate it. And the other thing is, so just because I'm using the two thin coats paints to paint this, you can use like all these techniques and things using other paints as well. There's nothing particularly special about these paints that you can't do with other paints. It's not like they are a revelation in terms of new paint. They just have slightly different properties. That I find, particularly like the white is as I said, really nice to use. But considering the cost of them, I don't know if I would pick up the whole range. I mean, I wouldn't pick up the whole range because there's just no need. But there's a couple of paints that I do really like in the set, particularly actually the Dark Sun Yellow. I'll get to that more when we come to the face paint for the non-metallic gold, but generally they're very nice paints, but I don't know if they are that different from the Games Workshop base paints to make it worth it. And again, similar for Vallejo. Like Vallejo is cheaper than both Games Workshop and the two thin coats, kind of like significantly cheaper than the two thin coats, and you get a lot of paint in the bottles, and the bottles are nicer. So because of that, I don't know really if I would be that concerned with getting the two thin coats paints. But as I said, there are some really nice paints among them. But yeah, I mean that's going to be like my view for most of the paints in there. You can see here I'm back to the white on the hook, and as I've already mentioned, the white is, it's just a really nice smooth paint, a very nice finish on it. Though, I mean, generally speaking, the whites from Games Workshop are awful. They look like sort of cottage cheese in the pots when you open them, and they need a lot of mixing to get this nice smooth finish. Whereas the white star paint, when you straight out of the bottle, small amount of water just to thin it a bit so it flows better. And all of these paints you need to thin them to use it. You don't really want to be using any of these from the bottle unless you're doing some like very harsh dry brushing. But then that is very similar for the Games Workshop and Vallejo colours too. You shouldn't really be using them straight from the pot because the paints are too thick, unless you're doing very specific styles of painting that need such heavily thick paint. Then you should be thinning them anyway. And I really dislike the two thin coats name of the paints because it's a nonsense. I mean, I suppose if you purely want to paint for like army painting, just to get the colours on the model quickly and easily, then sure, two thin coats is possibly a way to go. But in terms of like painting something to make it interesting, there's so many different ways and techniques of using paint that two thin coats doesn't mean anything. It's just like, I mean, I can only assume that the target of these is purely for army level painting, but I don't know why you would limit yourself to that style of advertising. So here you can see we're moving on to the shoulder pads now, because I've basically painted the front side of the hook. Now the aim here will be, and the hook, bear in mind, this is the first time that I've used these paints, so I didn't do any testing with them beforehand. I just went straight in to see how they would work on the goblin. So that's the only time so far that I've ever painted any non-metallic metal using these paints on the hook, and I think that turned out all right. It took a little bit more tweaking than I expected, some slight quirks of the paint, but now the aim here on the shoulder pad is to do non-metallic metal again, similar sort of colours, but to make the surface different, which is, I should be able to do, but because they're brand new paints, it does mean that I probably take a little bit longer and might not get it perfect compared to what I would not perfect as in like a perfect paint job, but the results I expect are probably a little bit different to what I achieve just for a first quick go. But as I mentioned, there are some positives to these paints, like having the very sharp marks on the thin paint, very thin paint, and that's really nice for my style of painting. Actually, it'd be more relevant later on when we get to painting the kind of cloak and hood on the goblin, and I actually really liked it for that effect as well. But it again does have that sort of thing where it's harder to get the translucent effect. So if you want like a very soft translucent layer of texture, you have to thin it more than you expect, and it's just a little bit more work. I do think using these paints in conjunction with other paint brands would give it the best kind of result, best of both worlds. So at the moment the shoulder pad's looking quite similar to the hook, but I'm going for a sort of a more scratchy look. There's going to be sort of specular highlights on the shoulder, which are just like the sort of like the shiny bling highlights that you see. And again, it's just using small amounts of paint on the tip of the brush, rub off the excess, and just use the very tip. I know a lot of people, when they paint things, they will push a little bit too hard, and that gives you a thicker mark, because the tip bends over, and as the tip bends over, as the brush goes, the bristles go further up towards the ferrule. Obviously, it gets wider. So if you push a little bit harder, you get a thicker mark, which is, a really good tool if you want to make thicker marks and things, even if you're using a thinner brush or a smaller brush. And actually, one of the things I like about using the smaller brush is that it kind of limits how big the mark can be. So I can push reasonably hard and still the mark is only going to be a certain size. Whereas if you go up to a, say, size 3 brush when you're painting, sure, the tip might be the same for doing fine detail work, but if you push a little bit harder, you make a much larger mark than you could make with the size 00. And I do get frustrated with people saying, "Oh, you can paint everything with a size 3 or whatever." Chances are, if you've used like a large brush for all your painting, you've adapted your painting style to be able to work with that. But I like to, at the moment anyway, I'm kind of adapting to using multiple sizes of brushes, because it gives me different tools to do different things, particularly things for glazing. Like large brushes are better. If you're doing glazing, the fewer marks you make, the smoother the finish. Because because it's a larger brush, when you make the mark, it covers a larger surface area, so that's why you get a much smoother finish. And just for blocking in colours as well, same thing. If you use a larger brush, you get a smoother finish quicker. I mentioned earlier on, for the shoulder pads, they have these very obvious flat shapes on them, I'm not entirely sure why the goblins make these hard edges on their armor, but it does mean that you can pick them out. What it kind of amounts to is that you're edge highlighting a lot with it. I'm not super keen on strong edge highlights on things all over because they're not very realistic, but if you have a hard metallic edge, it will catch more light, so it is more natural to paint the edges on these things. And also bearing in mind, because the models are very small, and if you're using them on tabletop, but even then, even if you are doing display level painting, you do need to have a certain level of clarity on an image, on a model, so you can kind of see what's going on. Then a little bit of edge highlighting can help bring out the detail. It's less important for larger scale pieces, but because especially something like this is a very small model, unless you're sticking it right in front of your face up close to look for things, if you haven't got some sort of like definition on the edge, then it kind of gets lost and you lose the clarity of the detail. So here I've gone back to the boar hide colour. I thinned this down. It's just off to the right a little bit. So this is sort of like a glaze, and I mean I like these paints for glazing. They still leave the paint quite matte, and this is something actually that I'm quite interested in having different surface sort of shines on a model. I have been going through a phase of painting models, and you saw this on the Loon Boss on Cave Squig that I painted for the Golden Demon, and I just covered the whole thing in matte varnish. And what I found was, I knew this would happen, but it does make the model look much more pastel, because when you have a matte surface, the light becomes diffused on it, and it just makes the colours like softer. Whereas if you're using like a satin or glass finish, the light isn't diffused over them, so the colours look much more vibrant. And so I was varnishing the model to have this really matte finish, and it just makes the whole thing look kind of too pale. Whereas what I'm kind of more interested in at the moment is using different paint brands to have like different finishes on the model, so I can have some areas that are a little bit more satin, some maybe even up to gloss, and then others more matte. And then that gives me more variety in the sort of like the surface of the model, like surface textures and surface finishes. And that also means I have more control over the saturation of the colors. And like not saturation in terms of pigment, this is just terms of saturation in terms of how the light hits the model to make the colors visible. So for example, if you had like a Land Raider, you sprayed it Mephiston red, then half of it you did like a gloss varnish and half you did with a matte varnish. Even though it's the same pigment on both halves, the gloss varnish will look like super deep, rich, like it'll look fantastic, and then the matte half will look very soft, a little bit pinky. But the differences are, the gloss one is obviously very shiny, so it looks, unless you want a shiny tank, and shiny things just tend to look worse, and it hides the paintbrush marks. Whereas the matte side, you can see all the paintbrush marks, all the details. It's never hidden by like a horrible shine going across. So everything that you've painted is always visible, but at the same time you lose that sort of like deep, rich color that you want as well. And then the kind of like the best and worst of both worlds is the satin thing. So that gives you a little bit of shine, you see a little bit of brushwork, but you never get good on either results for that. So everything's a compromise. What you'll find is that most pro painters will cover their models in matte varnish, because when you're posting the models on social media, you can't tell if it's matte or gloss from looking at it, and the matte varnish will hide reflections from the lamp, so it just photographs a lot better. But the thing is, like if you're doing a competition, you need the model to be good, to have that saturation, or like you might not want it to look so matte and sort of like softer colours in the flesh. But so it's more of a case of doing these things for seeing the models actually in person rather than for social media posting. Now you can see that I'm painting but I think it's a moustache. I couldn't quite figure out if it's like a moustache or supposed to be like tusks coming from the mask. It looks a little bit like the new dwarf. I can't remember what they're called, like the Overlord people, the Age of Sigmar dwarves now anyway, sort of steampunky dwarves. They have like sort of golden armor, and the mask on this looked kind of very similar to that, and I wondered if the goblin had taken one of those and sort of repurposed it. But anyway, it looks more like that because I painted it gold, and I'm going to assume it's a moustache because I think that's sort of interesting on a goblin. But I mentioned earlier in the video that I really like the Dark Sun Yellow. So this is a Balor Brown equivalent, but it's more saturated. It's a bit more yellow. The opacity is higher. So in many ways it actually works as a highlight to Balor Brown. But if you wanted a more yellow gold, then this is kind of like ideal for that as well. But I just found this lovely for painting the highlights on. I really like this color. So this is going to go into my regular paint list for painting gold. You can still get the same sort of effect if you took Balor Brown, added some yellow to it, maybe like a tiny touch of white just to increase the opacity, because yellow is generally a horrible color to paint with. So a touch of white in there increases the opacity to it as well, so it just doesn't look like a very translucent sort of sickly color when you apply it. But yeah, you can achieve the same thing if you want to mix the colors yourself. But this just really hit all the right buttons for me. If you look at how I've applied it, again, it's very similar to the other non-metallic metal effects that I've painted on there. So it's I filled it in to start with, as I said, with the boar hide sort of browny color, and then I went straight in for the Dark Sun Yellow, and then I have the Ice Yellow equivalent that I made earlier. Remember, that was Skulker Yellow mixed with white. So the Dark Sun Yellow is the top right colour on the wet palette. So it looks kind of orangey there. It's not orangey. I think the paint had maybe separated a little bit when it had been left on the palette, but it makes a much more yellow colour than is suggested there on the wet palette. The Skulker Yellow in the bottom middle of the wet palette, I don't actually use that. I wasn't sure, because I hadn't used the paints before, what sort of effect I was going to get, and I wondered if I would need to add a bit more yellow to the gold just to make it effective. But it turns out I didn't need to do that, so I don't actually use that. But if you wanted to make the gold a bit more yellow, then obviously you can glaze that on. So if you just take some of the Skulker Yellow, put it to another area on your wet palette, and add more water to it. So it's, I don't know, about 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint. You can then glaze that over areas of either highlight or mid-tone, and it will just make them look more kind of yellowy. Just be a little bit more careful if you're doing glazes like that, because as I said, the extra opacity of these colours, even when they're thinned, means that you can very easily block out the work that you've already done. And there you can see, I showed you how to do the moustache there, but I just carried on and did the same with the rest of the gold on the face. The problem with painting the face actually is because he's in the hood, it's very hard to show that on video, to show everything that I did on there. But it's very similar mark making to what I showed you with the moustache. The only thing I would say is that if you come to an area like a block of like a flat surface on this kind of thing, and you're wanting to fill that in but make it look interesting, so you can do very smooth finishes, and if that's the case, then you just have to do smooth transitions everywhere. But if you want to fill in an area and you're trying to get like a bit of texture or weathering or something like that, fill it with scratches, and that's these paints are ideal for that kind of thing. Very quick, sharp scratches to fill in an area. They'll fill the area with kind of like interesting detail without having to block it all in, and without having to get a smooth transition as well. And because the face shapes, there's a lot of flat surfaces on there, and it's angular. All the armor on this piece is angular. Anything that's non-metallic is angular. It's actually kind of something that I've noticed in a lot of Games Workshop models at the moment. They love adding hard edges to armor. I don't know why. It drives me insane because when I think of plate armor, it's smooth curves everywhere, and the thing is, curves are fantastic for painting non-metallic metal on. So it really drives me insane when I see all these, like particularly Chaos Warriors and things, models I would expect to have beautiful curved surfaces, and they've got like angles and everything. But it is what it is, so you have to kind of adapt. But I think actually for the goblin here, the design of it makes it sort of interesting because it's very harsh, the angles on, and then I just adapt those harsh angles and add more sort of scratchy marks everywhere, and it all kind of like works in that, with that effect. You did see me there painting the leather strips and the wood on the staff. Again, that was with the boar hide. As I mentioned before, the colours are a little bit limited at the moment. I think there's another Kickstarter that's either started or will start. They'll have more colours in it. I have no idea when those are coming out. I have no interest in backing Kickstarters for paints, so it's entirely up to you if you want to go and check that out. For the armor here as well, the forearm guard, painting this in the same way as the shoulder pad. What I discovered was I adapted the process a little bit as I went along. So what it is basically probably around about 50-50 Doom Death Black and Carcharodon Grey. Mix those together. That's the top left colour, and then Carcharodon Grey on its own, which is second from the left at the bottom there, and then straight after that just go right up to white. So I'm not adding any of the blues or yellows to the shoulder pad or the forearm guard, and that helps separate it out from the staff as well. It's basically just colours, and the staff itself isn't quite as sort of scratchy, so it looks like a different material, perhaps a little bit more polished on the hook. And then at the end of that, so same as I did on the shoulder pad, I went back in with the boar hide and just put that around sort of the rivets and like in the creases, or just maybe a little bit on the flat surfaces as well, where I've painted in like scratches. So if you go over those a little bit with the boar hide, or any, like if you just wanted to keep it black and white, you could just take some of the Doom Death, whatever it is, the black, and thin that down. You can glaze over the top of it, and that will knock back the marks a bit. Quite often I say when you're putting in texture, it's fine to over highlight them, because then you can go back with a darker colour, glaze over the top, it knocks it right back, and you get like a subtle texture then. So it's never really a problem for over highlighting areas with textures. And the same is very true with these paints as well, although I complained about having because they're so opaque in certain cases, it makes marks much stronger than I would initially like. I can still knock it back with glazes afterwards, and just to repeat myself, it is just a case of adapting to the paints. But having that as an option is really nice. So as I mentioned, I will be taking some of these and adding them to my regular paint use, but I won't be using all of them. So we were particularly, it's going to be the oranges. When I get to those, I had some negative experiences with the oranges, which is when the squig comes in, but that's not until towards the end of the video. There you can see, as I mentioned, the boar hide glazed down, just going around the rivets and things, just adding a little bit of colour. Sort of makes it kind of a bit rusty. Ideally, if I was doing this and had more colour options, I would separate the colours out a bit more between the rust on the armour, the wood on the staff, and the leather on the leather strap. But I did mention I was going to mix some colours. I do still mix the colours, but it's more for the highlights. So the variety of the highlights changes the colour, but the base kind of stays the same. But like, you know, ideally I would have had like something closer to Rhinox hide for the staff, maybe. You know, it doesn't matter too much. Like I said, I was just being lazy. I can only be bothered to mix so many colours. But I think there are at the moment only 2 browns, and the boar leather or boar hide is like my favourite one. The other one is cuirass leather, and you can just see I'm just adding a bit of water to that at the moment. That's the bottom right colour on the wet palette, because I'm going to use that on the cloak, like the hood, robe, whatever, of the goblin now. Because it's actually very close to grey. It's a very desaturated brown. I think it's actually closer to, rather than Rhinox hide, what's the bark? The bark colour anyway from Games Workshop, and this is very similar to that. So they don't have like a Rhinox hide equivalent. Or have I got this wrong? Oh, we have a scorched earth colour as well. So maybe I am wrong, but it's very hard to tell looking at the bottles. They look almost the same colour to me. Maybe the scorched earth is a little bit darker, but regardless, I'm using the Cuirass. Sorry. One day I'll be able to get paint names right. I'm using the Cuirass leather on the robe of the goblin, and as I mentioned, it's very desaturated. This is going to be more of the sort of scratchy effect. However, just because I'm doing a scratchy effect again, and you can see that I use that a lot on this model, I can still achieve a different finish. So the marks are very similar. You can see, and remember, when I first did the robes, I painted them with that grey that I mixed myself. So that sort of like give you some base work, a base to work on, but not that important. If you wanted, you could still go straight in with the cuirass leather, and start, because it looks very, very similar to the grey that I already had. And the marks I'm making, so you start off with them, they're a bit rough, but then you refine them, and so it's lots and lots of very tiny marks. On the brightest highlight areas, you can actually block it in. And you can see that I've added some white to the leather colour there as well. So the first stage highlight with just the straight paint from the bottle, just put scratches all over it, basically focusing more on where the light naturally hits. And you can see this in the video quite clearly. So he's got his little legs sticking out forward, so the top thigh section and knee, that's obviously the brightest part. Then to the right of that, the bottom of the robe flows out a little bit, that catches more light. Then when you look on the hood, it has that sort of a big curve as it goes towards the face. That's more like one of the main focal points on the model. So that's where we're going to be spending most of the time pushing up the highlights. So you can sort of block in those areas a little bit more with these highlights to start with, because you will be putting more texture work on top of them. So it's not worth spending a lot of time doing very refined textures when you're painting straight over the top of that. And also, if you're doing very refined textures straight away on top of the black, what happens is you get the black still showing through, whereas when you want these bright highlighted areas, you don't really want to see any of the black. The black is only relevant to the more shadowed and darker areas. So actually you're making your life a little bit harder by not blocking in those areas. But as I mentioned, it's just now a case of lots and lots of tiny marks. So it's very similar marks to how I've painted sort of the non-metallics on the shoulder pads and the forearm. But in this case, they are a lot smaller. So the same paint movements, just using the tip of the brush again, small amount of paint on the brush, rub off the excess, and then it's like lots of little scratches and sort of stippling, and at the same time looking for creases and details that are sculpted on. So you can just add a bit more detail, and it also makes more sense. Sometimes I ignore the sculpted on detail when they're like subtle creases or whatever, it purely depends on how I'm painting it and if it looks interesting or not. But it can sometimes look a bit weird if you've ignored them and just painted over the whole area. Now you can get away with it for photographs as well, especially if you have a matte finish, because the light won't catch those details very strongly if it's a matte finish. If it's a glossy finish, or you're looking at it in the in real life rather than on a photo, then you will be able to see these details because you can just naturally see them, especially because you're moving the model around, so light will still catch on them more subtly. And the highlights here again, so this is another section of highlight I'm adding, and it's just more of the white star to the cuirass leather. And as you can see, like, it hardly looks brown. It's a very, very desaturated brown. Like, it's a nice color, nice to work with, but it's as I said, there's not really a match for the Rhinox hide unless there is a new Kickstarter. And so this kind of mark making that I'm doing, I really enjoy doing these kind of marks. Lots and lots of tiny refined marks, just building up, adding a bit more white each time, going over it, shrinking the size of the highlight, like the light volume. And by light volume, I mean sort of like the block of highlight hitting it. So when you're doing all these textures, you have to kind of imagine that. So for example, that sort of crease between the ear and the nose, that's like that whole section across there is a similar sort of brightness, because that's where the curve of the hood is. So you're taking like a block highlight there. If you're going for edge highlight, you purely just want to paint edge highlights on things, so you're not interested in light volume, so you're more like the heavy metal style of painting. They would just paint a line going across there, but that creates a very harsh highlight. It'll pick out the detail, but it's not realistic in terms, and it doesn't really pay attention to the shape or like size of the curve. Whereas when you're painting a light volume on, you're actually trying to pay attention to the shape of the sculpt and make the light volume either softer or like tighter, or if you have to do like a very large block of highlight and then blend it in very quickly at the edges, going from the light highlight to the shadow, things like that. I prefer using light volumes for highlighting, and then picking out a few edges in with edge highlights as well. So it's sort of like a combination between the two, just so I get a bit of the detail and also the shape of the surfaces as well. I do find that edge highlights over curved surfaces quite harsh and jarring to look at, but at the same time, the edge highlight sort of technique that they use in heavy metal can be really useful for picking out all the other details on models. So sometimes it looks like edge highlighting looks way more detailed than painting light volumes as well. It's purely preference for what you like to do, but I prefer this style of painting because it gives me a bit more variety. You're working with light and surface texture and things like that. So I've paused on the robes a little bit. Like, you could leave them at this stage if you wanted. It does take a while. I would not recommend painting like this at all for army stuff. I know a lot of people would be like, well, it's got non-metallics, I wouldn't paint it like this anyway for army. Not really interested, but I am painting all of my goblins with non-metallics, even the lowly grots and things. So, but it's a much quicker way, so it's not refined. But if you look at it like from a distance, like you would see it on the table, then I go for a very high contrast look, and I think it stands out quite nicely. But if you don't like painting non-metallics, then I mentioned this in another video. You probably wouldn't enjoy this video. But so now I've gone back to the hood again after I quickly painted in the ears. The ears were painted with ethereal green was the highlight, and I think emerald green was the base color. The emerald green had kind of crappy coverage, like it was all right. All the paints still have the same kind of finish. They all have that slightly matte, really nice smooth finish to them, which I really appreciate. But the emerald just didn't seem to have the opacity of some of the other colours. The ethereal green, that was quite nice, worked pretty well for the highlight for it. Kind of sort of similar to moot green, I guess. Not quite as yellow, but does the same kind of thing. It does mean that for this particular goblin, he is more kind of green than I paint the other goblins, like, sort of more yellowy green, I guess. But like ethereal green was a nice color as well, and it's quite quick to do. I think some of the Games Workshop darker greens as well can have poorer coverage, and I'm guessing it's to do with the yellow mixed in with the green as well, because I know I said the ethereal green is more yellow, and you might think, well, why has that got better coverage then? But usually if it's a lighter color, it's got some white mixed in with it at the same time, so then that sort of increases the opacity. Because if you just take sort of like the normal yellow color and add it to a green, you get like a very yellowy green, but you still have the same problem. It just doesn't cover very well. Yellow's a sort of a horrible color, and kind of like the what colour was it? The Dark Sun yellow. Why I like that one so much. So it's called yellow, but it's not. It's sort of a brown colour. So it's got some red mixed in, and it's probably something else. There's probably like a small element of maybe black mixed in or whatever. But like it has very good coverage as well. So sometimes you can get around doing these colours having poor coverage by mixing it in other colours that they still look like the colour that you want, until you actually compare them with like the proper colours. So like the Skulker yellow compared to Dark Sun yellow, suddenly Dark Sun yellow doesn't look yellow anymore, but if you have Dark Sun yellow painted on its own on the model, it looks yellow. You can see that I'm doing a little bit of kind of glazing. So this is I just wanted to add a bit of colour to the robe. I did find that the Cuirass leather was very, very desaturated. I thought it would have had a bit more colour to it than that. It almost, like I said, looked black and white when I was painting it on. So I went with the emerald green, and as I mentioned, that has crappy coverage as well. But the nice thing about that is, so it's a lot easier to glaze with that. You don't have to thin it quite as much. And it's going to add some kind of green element to the robe, which then works as a contrast against the leather colours, to the browny colours, because those are quite red, and also you'll have the squig when that's painted up being a bit orangey as well, so you have like contrasting colours. But then I went in with the emerald green and just put a few dots on. Now when I did these, I did these quite badly on the video. I did have to go back and tweak these, and I tweaked these gradually. But the little green dots, they're like kind of like spores or something like that, just adding a bit of colour here and there. You could have other colours if you want as well, like maybe purple would be interesting. But I do actually paint the mushrooms on his shoulders in sort of a purpley colour as well. So it's up to you. But adding a bit of, just a few random colours in sort of the shadow areas, just for a bit of interest. So I didn't actually notice this when I first started painting the model, but he's actually wearing black gloves. I was a bit annoyed about that actually, because I was all set to paint fingernails and things on him and creases in the flesh, and thought that would be quite cool. But actually it's just wearing some leather gloves. I just went for black because I thought if I painted them brown leather, then that would kind of clash against the wooden staff. And I was just being lazy as well because I already had the grey paint on there. So I'm going straight in with the mix where it was roughly 50-50 Doom Death Black and the Carcharodon Grey. And pretty much edge highlights for these. So I'm painting the gloves in sort of a shiny black way. What you'll find is when you're applying this, you have to do these quite thin lines. Then I take the highlights up, so again through the grey up to white, with white as final dots on it. Keep the lines as thin as you can. If you make them a bit too thick though, don't worry, you can go back with the Doom Death Black, cut into them so you get like a very harsh line, or you can thin it down to a glaze again and just sort of glaze up to that. That'll give you a softer transition. but it makes the gloves look more shiny with a harder transition. Remember, these are quite small as well, so you don't really need to do the soft transition. Like if you were doing this for, let's say, a Golden Demon or whatever painting competition, you need to spend a bit of time getting smooth transitions. So even with very sharp, bright highlights, you have to do a transition at the edge. So it'll look probably fine in a photograph or depending on how you take the photo. You might have seen like certain memes on the internet where I think there was one where someone painted white lines on someone's legs, and when you first see it, it looks like they've got like shiny plastic sort of wrap on their legs or whatever, but it's actually just white paint painted on. So it looks fine when you first see it, but then actually when you know what it is, you can tell that it's paint, and you don't get any of the glow from the paint. So what you are doing with the little transitions at the edges of these bright highlights is you're giving it kind of like a specular highlight, like that sort of kind of glow effect at the edges, because when you get a glow, it always sort of fades out at the edges. It's never like going from like a hard line from one color to the next. I painted in like some so you can see they're just either side of the glove. I did paint it in the sort of the ropes, and these are painted the same way as the rope around his middle as well. That was, I think I just painted that in actually with the Dark Sun Yellow, and that's pretty much all it was. What you'll find is like it's a bit high contrast. I'd be tempted to mix in some of the boar hide with that for a start, and then use the Dark Sun Yellow as a highlight. But I just went straight in with the Dark Sun Yellow, and all it is slightly angled lines or dots in the case of the wrist one, because they're so small, and just do them like lots of parallel lines next to each other going around, like not horizontal or vertical, keep them at an angle, but just do a load of those going all the way around. It's quite simple. Now for the mushrooms on the staff, I wasn't too sure what to do with these. Then I thought they look kind of similar to some of the mushrooms on the cave walls in Skyrim, so I thought I'd just paint them kind of like that bluey white colour. So again, because I was feeling lazy, I had the colours on the wet palette, so I didn't have to mix anything new. For the base colour on these, I did go straight with the wolf grey, so I guess this is like a rip-off of Space Wolf grey. It's kind of like a baby blue colour, a little bit desaturated, got some black in it, but covers really nicely. And then so just blocking the whole thing to start with. Then I'm going to paint in the wood grain effect. Then I'll go back and paint those off. So I'll keep jumping around the models, but I think you get the idea as I go along. So I did use the artwork as reference for this, because when I looked at the artwork on it, I really liked the highlight next to the hand. So it's like extra highlighted there. It works like a focal point, drawing your eye to the middle of the model. And this is, again, it's the boar hide, and I've just added some white to it. Now normally if I was doing these things, I'm probably more likely to use ice yellow normally for adding highlights, just so I can add a bit of warmth to coloured highlights, but because there was no ice yellow equivalent and I didn't want to mess around too much, I was just adding white to things. I mean, I already mentioned the boar hide is quite a nice sort of vibrant rich colour, so you're still getting some yellowy kind of look to it as well. It's not that it's just going to go straight pink, and all I'm doing is just picking out the raised textures on there. So the sculpting on the wood on this, like, it's really nice, but it's kind of large in how it's exaggerated, so it has really deep creases in, which is great because you've got like these big details that you can easily see to pick out, basically just painting the raised areas on it. But if you wanted to paint this with more details on, that actually makes it a lot harder, because you've got these very definite recesses on, and then if you've got like a flat area, you think, oh well, I'll paint some like more kind of like wood grain effects in these. It all has to sort of match a little bit, and so you are then limited by the way they've been sculpted on. That's just a complaint from me. Like, it's completely irrelevant to I imagine to, like, if you're painting this for an army or whatever, like, no one cares that they've painted like large detail on the stuff, because it's actually making it easier for you to paint. But if you want to paint like super high detail things, and if they've got large kind of like exaggerated details sculpted on, then you're stuck with those details. Now going back to the mushrooms here, I watered down the colour a little bit too much, but I've gone with the wolf grey added with a bit of white, so that's the top second from the left. I've sort of blocked in the top section, so you're going to have the top is lighter and then underneath is darker, because that's the straight wolf grey from the pot, obviously mixed with water when I say straight wolf grey. But the I painted in the top of the mushroom or fungus, whatever it is, and then what I decided to do was actually put sort of feathering, like just lots of lines on the top, so it just wasn't plain. You could do whatever you wanted with these, actually make them really nice and vibrant, fancy colours. I kind of like most of my models to be quite heavily desaturated. I make them very moody. I like sort of a moody look, and then use like bright highlights as focal points, and then you can have the odd spot colour that's more saturated. So you can see on this I've got obviously the face mask and the ears. They stand out quite strongly with their colours, whereas everything around it is a lot darker. So now I've painted in the tops of the mushrooms a little bit more. Now back in with another stage highlight on the wood grain, and again, so as I mentioned, this is taken as reference from the box art, and the brightest highlights are just right underneath the hand there. It's just a case of layering over the top of them. Try not to have the paint too thick, which isn't, I say, that's not a major problem for these paint. I mean, it's actually more of a problem if you let them get thicker, because you're getting a very harsh mark then. There's not going to be any translucency to it at all. Whereas if you had the paint a little bit thinner, then you get a nice clean mark, but a bit of a translucent element. Because what I like to do is, like with the paint a bit thinner, do multiple layers, and you get a transition just using one colour as you build up the layers. Whereas this, you have to sort of work a little bit harder to get to use that sort of effect. So here you can see I'm just going to put in loads of little lines on tops of these mushrooms, and I take it all the way up to white as well. And also I paint in an edge highlight going all the way around, just to give them a bit of definition, because what you'll find is when you paint these lines going on, it'll leave kind of like a dot on where it touches the edge. So you just go around and pick out the or use the edge of the tip of the brush and just paint the edge highlights like that, because the edge will naturally follow the shape of the brush. Then just for a bit more fun, so some of the colours on this, I was just messing around with seeing what would be interesting. So I've gone back with the green colour, whatever it was, emerald green, and then I watered that down, turned it into a glaze. So around about 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint. I was actually using my mixing brush there. That's a Games Workshop base. What was it? Yeah, small base brush. I don't know. It was just a spare brush that I had laying around. I just used that for mixing paint, but it did the job for getting a bit of green onto the model. So I basically glazed on emerald green at the bottom of the staff, because that sort of hid the fact that it's not highlighted all the way along with the wood grain. It makes it kind of interesting, because you have like a dark section at the bottom. It makes it look like the staff's gone maybe a bit mouldy. And then I also glazed in a little bit more green on the bottom of the cloak. Off video, I did spend a bit more time. You'll see towards the end of the video that the model changes here and there as I go along. But the bottom of the cloak, I did work it in a little bit better, just to so it looked a bit neater, but using the same techniques and same colours I've already used. The mushroom here, I've painted this in with one of the red colours. I think this might be Berserker red. It's hard to tell from looking at the pots. Yes, Berserker red, so I had to open it up to have a look. And this was alright, like the coverage wasn't as good as some of the others. I did find the reds a little bit underwhelming compared to the Games Workshop reds, but they still did the same job, and they still had that lovely kind of matte finish as well. I don't think I would swap the reds out for... I mean, I don't think I would take these reds over the Games Workshop ones, but you know, I have them now anyway, so I mean, I'll probably use them, but my favourite red is still Mephiston Red from Games Workshop. But, you know, this just gives me more options, I guess. This is sort of like a more pinky kind of red to it. You can see as well, so I started painting the boots that's standing on the mushroom. This is also painted in the same style as the shoulder pad and forearm guard, but because it's like very far forward, I put a bit more effort into making it stand out like as a bright shiny thing. It has very large angles on it as well, sharp tip on it, so the tip is quite handy because then I can use that as a strong highlight. I pretty much just picked out the edges on it, edge highlighting all the way around, apart from at the bottom, which shows a reflection of the mushroom colouring. The reflection is very strong the way I've painted it on there. I mean, it's not realistic, like that's basically a mirror finish with how strong that highlight is. It should be much sort of more diffuse, and you probably hardly see it actually with how kind of scratchy, you know, the way that I painted the rest of the metal on the armor. But it's kind of interesting. I always say this, but if something looks cool, then that's better than if it's technically accurate. So in this case, it's just like a little nice, interesting feature. But you know, I'm sure some people would tell me that it shouldn't be such a strong reflection. But you know, who cares? Here you can see, like, so the front kind of crease and picking that out in the white. Just be a little bit careful with how you do these sort of highlights. Don't take everything up to white. Keep it limited. The less white that you use, the more effective the white is. If you pick out every edge highlight in white, then it starts to look a bit like a Tron kind of highlight. You know how Tron has like these glowing lines going everywhere, and that's sort of the effect you'll get if every edge highlight is taken up to white. It's so strong and overpowering that everything has the same weight to it. So here I'm going to be painting in same again, the like lines on top of the mushroom. This one's nice and big though compared to the ones on the staff, so this is a bit easier to see. It's actually kind of more fun as well. I'm starting off with a size 2 Artist Opus brush, and these lines I'm putting on, they're very simple to do. Not too much paint on the brush, like rub off the excess on your thumb, or you know, wet palette, whatever you use to just take the excess off, and then just draw the line towards yourself. So as you paint them, like kind of like turn the model round a little bit, and it's just lots of parallel lines. Well, not quite parallel, so they're all going to like a point in the middle. If you think of the middle, where the middle of the mushroom is, each line should aim to be hitting the middle of the mushroom, and then just go all the way around doing that. So do it all the way around with the first highlight, and then I've added a bit of the star white to it, and I just keep going over. But when I add the white each time for each layer, so you can see that I've swapped over my brushes now. I'm now on a size 00. I'm a little bit more picky on where I put the highlights, so they're not going all the way around this time. There are certain details sculpted onto the mushroom, so I will pick those out and make those sort of a priority because they're sculpted on, so those need to be picked out. And then it's sort of like more of a choice. I'm looking for sort of undulations in the surface, like if it's a bit more raised or whatever, then I will sort of focus on giving that more detail. The reason I say this, that you have to be more picky with how you put the lines on, as you know, you take the highlight layers up more, is because if you just go over all of the lines all the way around each time, adding more white each time, you're massively desaturating it. You're creating really, you're just taking away the red base color. Now, I wanted to take away quite a bit of it anyway because I wanted, you know, the detail to be obvious on there. But if you want to see some of the red, so you can see more as it goes around behind the foot, it stays a bit darker there, so you can just see that it's still like a red mushroom. So here we are painting the leather straps. I am, if you remember, I painted the straps to start with boar hide, but then I'm using dwarf flesh and one of the orange colours. What is it? Fanatic orange. So I guess I guess that's a rip off of Trollslayer Orange. You know, they are obviously have been quite strongly influenced by some of the Games Workshop colours, which again, like, it seems a bit lame to me, but you know, it is what it is. So the first highlight is the Fanatic Orange over the Dwarf Hide, the Boar Hide, and then it's the what's it, Dwarf? Where's it? Yeah, the Dwarven Skin is the next one. I wasn't overly keen on the names of the flesh colours in the set. They have things like elf flesh, dwarven or elf skin, something like that, dwarven skin, and then berserker or no, barbarian brawn as the dark colour. And it's kind of like, you know, if you've got darker skin, then suddenly you're a barbarian, whereas if you've got the light skin, you're an elf. You know, I feel like they could have just called them light skin or dark skin or whatever. You don't have to attribute races to the names of the skin, but you know, again, interesting choices for paint names. Earlier on, I mentioned that I wasn't keen on some of the colours, and the Fanatic Orange. I mean, you're going to see this more as we get into the Trollslayer, not the Trollslayer, the Squig oranges. But it's also true of the Fanatic Orange. It just didn't have good coverage. I was going over the colours with it, and it seemed to hardly leave any marks with it. I know, like, again, I have a similar kind of issue with the Games Workshop. The Trollslayer Orange has pretty poor coverage as well, and I imagine it's again linked to the fact that it's yellow that's been added to it. But for some reason, I actually found it harder to cover with it than the Trollslayer Orange. Now, it might just be the case that because it has a more matte finish, so it might be the case that they have very similar levels of badness, Trollslayer and the Fanatic Orange, but because the Trollslayer is slightly more satin, you see the colour a bit more. That might just be the case, but I did find it irritating to work with anyway. And you can see there as well, so I put another colour in the top right of the wet palette there, because I needed a bit more darkness, a bit more high contrast in the leather. So I went back with the other brown colour that wasn't the Cuirass brown, Scorched Earth. There we go. So I went in with that at the edges, but you know, so the colours that I painted the leather on that, they probably could have been a bit better, but they're all right. So now this is where I get a bit irritated with the orange, and you'll see like a time jump in the video. I was trying to do something interesting with the squig, so I started off with blue. This is marine blue, which again is based on ultramarine blue, and you know, that works fine. Nice coverage, nice finish, good colour. Nothing more to say than that. And you just kind of like block in the whole squig. I didn't actually realise this until I started painting it, but the squig seems very heavily influenced by Batman. If you look at the front of his mask, he has sort of like a Batman mask on him, and so it kind of turned out that the colours that I used for him, the sort of the bluey, like darker looking orange squig, kind of fitted in nicely with him. Here you can see I'm just blocking in the teeth colour as well. Back to my favourite, the boar hide, just to very quickly pick out all the teeth in that, but they will be highlighted up with different colours, so the teeth will still look different to the leather and the wood, where I've used that in other areas. So now this is where I'm starting off. I did mix some of these colours again for the highlights, because I am going for an orange squig, but it's a bit more interesting starting with a blue base. Is going to, I mean, you'll see the final result, but what I've gone for is, so the marine blue in the bottom left was the base color. Then I've just added what's that? I went with Sanguine Scarlet, and you can see that was mixed with the blue. So if that's the color to the bottom right, that makes it basically purple. But I skipped that one when applying it for the start, and the next is I think it's actually still Sanguine Scarlet, but mixed with a small amount of blue. So it's still, it's a bit purpley. It might actually be, now that I'm looking at it, Demon Red. It's one of the reds anyway. I did use all the red colours in different stages, so you can see them all, and they're all various mixes. The only two colours straight from the pot on that section on the wet palette, so as I mentioned, the marine blue, and then on the far right on the top, that is the orange colour that I mentioned, the Fanatic orange. So and actually I was wrong then, the colour below that as well, there's orange flare below that. So there's only like 3 colours actually on there that are straight from the pot. The other ones are all mixed variations going from those two. So the other colours, as I said, there's Demon Red, Sanguine Scarlet, Fanatic Orange Flame. Yeah, those are the colours that I've used. So sorry about that. I have to keep checking the paint names, but so there's all these variety of colours. The first stage highlight that you can see here, applying it, just picking out the raised areas on the squig, there, it's quite easy. So you can see I was using a larger brush as well. Don't have to worry too much about picking out the details exactly. Remember how I was talking about on the non-metallic metal areas, like if you've got a section that is a bit plain, just add some scratches to it. I use the same sort of process on the squig, but because it has the orangey kind of colours on, they are sort of more translucent. They don't stand out as much, but it just fills in the area with a little bit of detail. But what I did find was that I got so frustrated, so I started skipping colours. So I missed out the Demon Red, no, the Sanguine Scarlet. I'm going to get these colours right at some point. I missed out the red that's second from the left at the top, because when I started applying that, it just doesn't make any difference to what I was how I was applying it. So it's pretty much, I think it's Demon Red mixed with Fanatic Orange at this stage, or a small amount of Fanatic Orange mixed in. And you can see here, like I keep going over the colours, like over the details that I've put in, and it's just hardly making any difference. And I was getting really quite frustrated, because if I was using something like Wild Rider Red or Evil Sun Scarlet from Games Workshop, I know the marks would have been clearer. Now I'm not sure if it's something that I've done, that, like the way I'm using them or what, but I was not getting on with these sort of orangey colour, these marks that I was trying to make. I was having to put in a lot of effort to achieve the results I wanted anyway. So you can see that I keep going over the raised areas, and it was taking a lot longer than I wanted. And what I actually end up doing is I end up snapping, and then I just go to using the Fanatic Orange, which is the one on the top right. So I skip all the in-between ones, go straight up to Fanatic Orange, and just started painting sort of textured line work on the squig. So you can see that on this little section here, I've spent quite a bit of time doing it, but there will be a time jump in a moment, and I'll just have gone over all the detailed areas using the Fanatic Orange, and then if anything stands out too strongly, I will go back to the other mixes and use those to blend it in, basically like sort of glaze layers, which is that's a fine way of working as well. You can quite easily paint in like harsh details, kind of like what I was talking about with the other highlights on the model. So it's not the end of the world, but I just found the colors were almost not worth having. And you can kind of see there a little bit on the back of the leg where I painted in the highlight. So it starts off all right. It looks like you've got some mark in there. Then as it dries, it just becomes more and more translucent. And like I sort of, because I'm getting frustrated, I'm trying to get more paint on the model just to make a mark on it. And it's not, you can see it wasn't a case that the paint was too thin. I am, if anything, I'm using the paint a little bit thicker than the other paints that I've used on the model. I think it might be a case I'm exaggerating the issue, and it, like, if I'd used the Games Workshop oranges, so like Fire Dragon Bright and Troll Slayer orange, I'd have like a similar result. But because I was sort of already trying to adapt the previous colors that were having such strong marks on the model, it was kind of shocking to suddenly have these these paints where I'm trying to paint sections on with these details, where I'd actually decided that it'd be interesting to paint on details, and having a much harder time doing it than I actually expected, considering the other paints in the range. At the same time, though, the actual effect that I achieved at the end, I quite like the result. So you can, even if I'm not happy or I was getting frustrated with how the paints were reacting, it doesn't mean that you can't do something interesting with them. It's more of a case that, and this is true for all paints, once you learn what the properties of the paint are, then you can use it how you want. Like you know how it will work, and then you use that because that's how it works, rather than seeing what it does and then being annoyed that it doesn't do what you wanted it to do, even though you didn't know if it would do that to begin with. So you can see again, I keep going over these like creases in the leg and things. I've spent I say quite a while. It's not like that long, but I was expecting to pretty much do one mark and done on each of these sections. Like I thought I would have got the whole squig covered by this stage, but I'm literally just going over and over these sections trying to get some opacity to the marks in there. And so now this is the brightest orange that I'm using, or like the brightest one that was in this range that I could use, and this is the orange flare. I suppose if I really wanted, and I do this for the final highlights, but you can add a bit of white to the orange flare. It'll make it much more opaque, because remember the white star, that's like a really nice paint because it has like good opacity as well. So by adding that little bit of white to the highlight color, you can see that in the top left there, it really makes the marks a lot stronger. And you can see where I've applied it actually on the model. So there was that cut where I just basically covered the model in these lines with these brighter highlights, just so that I could get it done in a timely manner. Here you can see I've started painting the gums as well. This is Sanguine Scarlet, and I've mixed in a little bit of white with it as well, and that's pretty much how I'm going to highlight it. It has the blue base coat underneath it as well, so that helps to kind of knock back any yellow element that's in the red, and then it's just a case of painting it over it and then adding a bit more white each time, layering it up, picking out the details. So it's quite straightforward to do. But again, the coverage wasn't amazing with the Sanguine Scarlet. It does seem like kind of a mixed bag between all the paints, with what covers well and what doesn't. But that's true again of all paints. Like certain colours are much easier to work with than others. But I did feel that for this range, the kind of like anything in the red going through to orangey yellow colours, they weren't as good at covering as I kind of hoped they would be. But then for other colours in the range, they covered way better than I expected they would. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Dark Sun Yellow, such a nice colour to work with. And even for the colours that don't cover that well. So you can see with the squig here, it didn't cover amazingly well, but the result is really nice. Like the kind of almost matte finish, and with how smooth the layers of paint are, it all works well. So you won't go wrong using the paints, but you just have to. I think it's probably more a case of just practicing with them, learning how the paints work, and then you'll be able to get really nice results with it as well. For the teeth here, I'm doing these in a quite easy way. So it's just lines on top. I thought that would fit nicely with the lines that, the kind of skin fold creases that I've painted on there. So most of those lines that I've painted on are kind of, they're not sculpted on, it's just extra detail that I've added, and I've used the extra detail just to fill the space so that I don't have to do smooth transitions everywhere. It's always a handy tip that if you paint detail on the surface, you will fill the surface way easier than having to paint a smooth perfect transition on it. For the highlights on the teeth, so remember the first layer was boar hide, but my aim was that I was going to use dragon fang, and there's a skeleton bone colour. I can't remember what the name is offhand, but they're very similar. So what I ended up doing was taking the skeleton bone colour and adding a bit of white to it, so it had more of a step in between. Some of the colours in this set are very, very close to each other, which is quite a strange option because there's not that many colours to pick from, so I would have thought they could have spaced them out a little bit more, because from what I read about it, there's some idea of using colour triads for selecting your paints. Now, as far as I understand, colour triads are based on the colour wheel, and it's, you have a triangle over the colour wheel, and it's 3 paints evenly spaced from each other, so they all work together, and it makes quite an interesting visual statement using those 3 colours. But the way they seem to have determined the triad system is to have a base, shade, and highlight. So you have like your base colour, give it a wash, and then you give it a highlight. But that's not how I understand triads to be. So I think they've just used the name as a kind of like an advertising thing. It's not really a colour triad at all. So as I was saying, the colours, some of the colours are very close to each other. But that doesn't matter too much because you have enough colours in the set really to mix them together. It's purely for convenience. So if you're doing army painting and you want to use the same colour over and over again, if you've had to mix that colour, that's a bit of a pain. But apart from that, you can mix the colours that you need depending on how lazy you are. So as I said, I've been using the dragon fang and the skeleton bone mixed with some white, and then the final highlight is just going straight up to the white star, and it's just a case of painting some lines on, focusing towards the tip of each tooth, and then the white star at the end, just the very, very tip, and that creates a bit of contrast. So because the dark lines, the gaps in between the lines that you painted on, they're wider at the bottom near the gum, so as they get more towards the tip of the tooth, they narrow down, and that will naturally make the tooth look lighter at the top. I mean, you are painting it lighter at the top as well because you're not painting the white lines all the way down, but it works in both ways. So you've painted the highlights on, but also the dark area is getting smaller each time as well. So now the final part to paint on the model is the mask. So Batman's mask. For a start off, when I first saw this model, I thought the mask was supposed to be metal and it's just hammered onto him. I'm not sure. So I decided that it was black leather, but I only decided this halfway after I started these lines. So I thought, it doesn't actually. So the sculpting is very similar to the shoulder pads. That's why I thought it was metal. But then when I looked at it, I thought, no, he looks like Batman. This is supposed to be a mask that he has on. And I couldn't see that many rivets holding it onto his head. I'm not entirely sure how the leather mask stays on either, but I thought, well, it'd be interesting anyway. So instead of just having non-metallic metal all over the model, I will paint it as a black leather piece. But the problem is with the way that it's sculpted on, they are still quite harsh edges, and this is partly why I thought it was a metal faceplate. I mean, it might be a metal faceplate. I just might have got it wrong. But it whichever way you choose to paint it, like if you want to paint it as metal, that's fine as well. I don't think it would matter too much either way. But so just for the purposes of this, I decided I'm going to paint it as a leather surface, but because it has these really sharp edges on, which I think are formed to the shape of the Squig's face. I basically just went around and edge highlighted everything. That will make a very strong, definite shape, and the problem is that's not a lot like fabric then. But it is quite similar to how I started off painting the non-metallic parts of the armor. But the idea is that you use a lot less paint when you're doing it. You're just focusing purely on the edges. I'm still going to put some scratches and things on, particularly around the edge of the mask all the way around, so that will be sort of more tatty. And this is going straight way using the Carcharodon coloured paint, which again is a really nice one, covers very, very well. So it's ideal for this kind of work where you're just painting in details. And like I said, when you use this paint, because it makes such a clean, clear mark, then you probably will have to knock it back a bit. So what you can see is I've got some black paint on my wet palette there as well. You can just water that down a little bit, so it makes it more translucent, and then sort of just glaze over the edges a little bit, just basically trying to make sure that there's plenty of black on the model, because the more black that you leave on there, the more it looks like it's actually a black material. And so you can see, even though I've used the same colours pretty much on the mask there as on the armour, there's a large difference in the surface colours overall, just because there's way more white added to the armour, and also I paid more attention to the reflections on the armour. So there's lots of like specular highlights, which is just a fancy way of saying the sort of bling bits. Like I haven't done anything like that on the face mask, and that's kind of like so there's very little in the way of light volume work on the face mask at all. I've just tried to keep the which isn't necessarily accurate, because it's like I painted light volumes all over the rest of the goblin boss, but on the mask they're not really there, and this is again another case of like tweaking what is correct just to make something look interesting, because I just wanted to vary the surfaces on the model a little bit. And then there's a fine little tweak here. I painted a quick yellow moon on his forehead, just for a bit of detail, just to make him stand out a bit. I thought if the Squigboss has this squig on his as his own personal pet, then it's probably a more important squig, so he gets a little yellow moon. And I freehanded that on using again the Dark Sun yellow, which again is, I'm guessing, a play on the Tau with Shadow Sun as the character model. So I don't know, I mean, I do find it a bit awkward that they've based the names of the colours so much on the Games Workshop range, but there's I'm sure it works as an advertising thing anyway. So here, just the final little thing on the face mask is to add some few white dots here and there. This is kind of optional. I'm doing this for the high contrast, so the detail stands out a bit more. It is pushing it more really than it needs to be, but it does allow you to focus on that squig a bit more. And there you can see there's the final thing. So I say the final thing, I have a couple of bits on the back to just finish off. So I haven't quite done his, so on the back of him he has like a little bag that has these mushrooms in, so you can see the mushrooms on his shoulders. He's got a little bag with those in, and I haven't finished that there yet. That's just base coloured, but apart from that he's pretty much done and will be ready to go in my army. The only thing really I didn't show you how to paint was the eyes on the squig, and the main reason for that was that because they're in kind of like deep recessed sockets, it was really hard to get any kind of clear image on how to do that, and basically you would have just seen my head in the way on the camera, so that's why you didn't get to see that. But I mean, hopefully that'll give you some idea on how you can achieve these results. And like I said, you can do this same painting just using, if you wanted to use Vallejo paints or Games Workshop paints, or any other of the like Reaper paints, whatever, like the theory behind all the painting will work with any of those paints. It's not like you need any special kind of colors or anything like that, because that is something that people kind of ask me. They're like, what paints do you use to achieve these effects? And the actual paints, they don't really matter. Just some will work a little bit better than others for specific tasks, but even if they work badly, you can still make them work. For example, how I made the orange work on the squig there. But anyway, yeah, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a bit interesting trying to do the combination of the paint review and painting the model at the same time. It did make it a little bit trickier for me, I think, because it meant there was kind of a lot more information that I had to get across while speaking about it. So I probably won't do that again, but it was kind of an interesting try anyway. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.